The Viet Cong. The enemy is seen through his own eyes, his own propaganda films. Except for those films, he remained largely unseen. The Viet Cong had a talent for disappearing. The Vietnam War was unlike most wars in American history. In other wars, we knew the enemy and could identify him. In Vietnam, our enemies could hardly be distinguished from our friends. The Viet Cong melted into the jungles, mingled with the local civilians, and waited for the moment to attack. Most of the battles were short and swift, firefights, ambushes. The strategy was to hit and run and vanish. The Viet Cong, later joined by the regular army of North Vietnam, was waging war against the most powerful nation in the world. Communist troops were the targets of huge quantities of modern weapons. They suffered tremendous losses, and yet they persevered. Vietnam was more than firepower. It also was willpower. The enemy was well supplied with that. American combat troops first landed in Vietnam in 1965, and from the beginning they found it to be a dangerous, frustrating war. It was not then a war of pitched battles. It was instead an episodic war. Landmines and booby traps and sniper fire. No single news report could sum up all the frustrations of trying to find and fight an elusive enemy. But the film you're about to see includes quite a few of them. The correspondent, Dan Rather.
U.S. forces now say they have solid intelligence reports that Chinese communist advisors are operating with the Viet Cong in this area.
Stay on the road.
In this village, along the Saigon River's banks, residents admit a Viet Cong battalion with Chinese advisors spent the night, moving out just a few hours before U.S. troops came in. Our troops continue burning every hut they find and all crops, convinced that practically every man, woman, and child in this section belongs to the Viet Cong. In charge of today's mission, Captain Edward Yago.
There is soon to be VC. This entire area has been under VC control for many years, and we consider every suspect to be VC.
Now, what are you doing with these people?
We're checking them, trying to find out intelligence information, whether or not VC were in the area. We found a lot of indications that VC have been here. A lot of rice. We found over 18 tons of rice, ammunition, papers, VC certificates, etc.
And what are you doing with these people?
We're getting them now and trying to make a note so they can have safe passage back to hamlets they have set up. The nearest one here at Chung Lap.
These are new life hamlets?
These are new life hamlets, so anybody we find in this area, we can evacuate them back and they'll have food and shelter.
As the villagers are walked away, soldiers of the 1st Division pour gas grenades into the bunker and tunnel complex that catacombs the village. This is gas designed for riot control. Non-lethal, but it can make a human uncomfortable and helpless long enough to disarm him. That's Lieutenant John Olson from Pattville, Wisconsin, throwing in the gas. He says he doesn't like using it, but calls it the only way to handle these intricate bunkers and tunnels without extreme risk to the lives of his men. No one, alive or dead, is found in the holes. But just as the gassing ends, heavy shells start pouring in on the U.S. troops involved.
What's going on? Where's the landing? Back here?
In the first confusing moments, the company commander thinks we're being hit by our own artillery or airstrike. But those are enemy shells coming in, it is said later. No one is certain what kind, but the men under fire believe they are 120-millimeter mortar rounds. The 120-millimeter mortar is a Chinese favorite, copied from the Russians. Whatever it was, injured 2 soldiers, including this one who took shell fragments in the shoulder. Later, this same unit tries to move an armored convoy out of its campsite along the river. Because of the French Army's sad experience with tanks and other armor in Vietnam, U.S. forces have been leery of using it. But this is the dry season, and the terrain here is comparatively high. And some of the brass insist on experimenting with armor. The tanks and armored personnel carriers move less than 2 miles from the camp when one tank is disabled by a mine. Enemy fire opens up from surrounding bushes, and a furious fight to defend the tanks ensues.
This armored convoy is trying to move out of the area we were just sweeping through. One of the tanks has been hit, and the Viet Cong has opened fire on the convoy and are now firing back and have asked rare support.
Infantry support rushed to the scene, comes in, guns blazing. Enemy fire keeps some of the late arrivals pinned down for a while, but eventually the disabled tanks have an infantry defense perimeter. The tankers come out of their vehicles again, and the firefight rages on.
It's this way approximately half the time still in South Vietnam when we try to move convoys. Dan Rather, CBS News, with the 1st of the 60th, 1st Division Tank Attachment Element, South Vietnam.
The communist forces made do with what they had. Sometimes modern weapons, sometimes weapons that could only be described as primitive. Much of the time they improvised, using captured weapons or manufacturing their own. They were at the least ingenious, as Bernard Kalb reported in 1968.
The Viet Cong today get their most sophisticated weapons from the communist countries, but a dud U.S. bomb is a gift from heaven. The bomb is defused. The steel casing is used to make shrapnel. The TNT is carefully collected. It will be used for grenades, mines, and mortar shells. A discarded tin can is filled with TNT and pieces of metal and glass. It is then set into the ground and camouflaged, a homemade mine. Some of these mines will explode when a tripwire is kicked. Some will explode on contact. The Viet Cong have also dug into their own Vietnamese history. They have rediscovered traditional weapons that were used against enemies of the past. A kicked tripwire can drop a wasp's nest on your head. This arsenal may be old-fashioned, but it's lethal. A tiger trap for men. These razor-sharp spikes of bamboo are often poisoned with human feces. These punji sticks are so dangerous that all American combat boots now have soles lined with steel. Their strategy calls for constant sabotage, and their sabotage is selective. The Viet Cong study their targets in miniature. Planning can take weeks, sometimes months. The explosives are prepared. Bridges, buildings, roads, tanks, convoys. Everything that's American or South Vietnamese is a likely target. Reconnaissance finds the railroad bridge unguarded. The result is predictable. railroad in South Vietnam operates for long, the Viet Cong have seen to that. An ambush, an act of war in which the guerrillas excel. The targets here are tanks and armored personnel carriers manned by South Vietnamese troops. From out of the jungle, a sudden barrage of Viet Cong firepower, followed by the Viet Cong. This film comes from communist sources. It is the kind of combat film that the VC show to their new recruits for morale purposes. It's all part of what the Viet Cong call the 4 quicks and a slow. The quicks are advance, assault, clear the battlefield, and withdraw. The 1 slow is preparation, like ambushing this column of tanks and blowing the bridge. The quick withdraw is often total disappearance. This is a carefully camouflaged doorway leading into a network of tunnels that the Viet Cong have dug throughout South Vietnam. You will notice that some of the Viet Cong are women. The VC regard women as equals, and as equals, they fight. The tunnels enable the VC to disappear in the midst of a battle and to reappear when the killing looks good. This is a typical Viet Cong tunnel complex, dug more than 25 feet below an ordinary Vietnamese village. Below ground, some rooms are as large as a living room. They may house a hospital, a small weapons factory. Above ground, there is an early warning system. The tunnels have several entrances. Below the surface of a pond, under a hut floor, under an animal pen, a well, a haystack. The Viet Cong can go in one entrance, exit 1.5 miles away.
Some of the most extensive tunnels have been dug at Cu Chi, 25 miles northwest of Saigon. That led to the formation of an American volunteer unit called the Tunnel Rats. Their assignment was to hunt the enemy underground. This tunnel war was not widely reported at the time, but 10 years after the war, Morley Safer interviewed some veteran tunnel rats.
It was you versus the enemy.
And you had to go in head first, correct?
Right. Oh, yes. Always. Never feet first anywhere.
Risky business, Marlon.
So you had to have somebody on your feet when you went to.
Always went in with your hands out in front of you, too, because if you got your arms trapped to your side, you were stuck there. You were just there, period. If you didn't get your arms through first, you couldn't get out.
What did you find, apart from Viet Cong, what did you find down there?
I came across one time a tripwire that was located in the tunnel, and it led to a box that was at the side of the tunnel that had been carved out, and in that box was about 10 or 15 very angry scorpion spiders. There was a bamboo snake. We found this a couple of times where they actually had the snake tied to a piece of bamboo that was stuck into the top of a tunnel. It's probably been tied up there for 3 or 4 days, and that viper will strike at whatever comes through.
You used to go down there alone.
Right, sir. I used to go there alone.
Why?
I was trying to show them in a way that by me being alone, that I was not afraid of them. I was not afraid at all. They didn't scare me one bit.
You would be amazed at just how sharp your senses become when you're in that tunnel. Your sense of hearing is so acute. You could hear, if there was someone else in the tunnel, you could hear him breathing. And you would be able to hear whether he was crawling towards you or away from you.
Or he had weapons.
And if you heard someone crawling, hopefully he was crawling away from you.
But there was barely room for your shoulders. You couldn't get, there was no room to maneuver.
That's right.
Absolutely not.
That's right.
No room to maneuver. If you came under fire, it's like you're in a shooting gallery. There's no place for you to go.
Tell me, when you flushed out a tunnel, took prisoners, killed some people, was that the end of the active life of that tunnel?
You only owned that piece of ground while you stood on it. As soon as you moved out of the area, Charlie moved right back into it. That was this type of war.
Above ground, American strategy included the use of air power to pound away at the enemy's hiding places. Another strategy was pacification, the continuing effort to win the hearts and minds of the peasants of Vietnam and to deny the Viet Cong their loyalty. On at least one occasion, those two strategies coincided. John Lawrence reported.
Forward!
The 1st Air Cavalry Band will go anywhere for a parade, even within rifle range of the Viet Cong. Appropriately playing Yellow Ribbon, the band is a highlight of Happy Day in Happy Valley, a celebration marking the end of communist domination in the valley. About 100 of the valley's 22,000 Vietnamese inhabitants gather to hear the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Ackerson.
The Viet Cong have terrorized you and have burned your homes. We are here to help you rebuild your homes and recultivate your fields.
Việt Cộng thường đến đây đốt nhà đồng bào. Thì hiện nay đó, quân đội Mỹ đến đây để giúp đồng bào đẩy lui Việt Cộng.
And finally, to show how much we are able to protect you, we are going to have the Air Force hit some Viet Cong on the other side of the valley. That will be at 10:30.
A show of military strength and a reminder of the close presence of the Viet Cong. And through it all, with bomb blasts instead of bass drums, the 1st Air Cav Band played on.
Airstrikes could punish the enemy, but you had to find him first. One answer was Operation Ranch Hand, the spraying of chemical herbicides over much of Vietnam to deny the communists both food and cover. That created a continuing controversy over the effect of the chemical Agent Orange. But defoliation, as it was called, was pursued on the ground as well. Mike Wallace reported.
This Rome plow, made in Cedartown, Georgia, may not look like much of a weapon, but it turns out it's a potent weapon in the fight against the Viet Cong. The engineers of the 1st Division are using it to knock down the jungle and so deny the VC a sanctuary in Binh Duong province north of Saigon, the spot General William Westmoreland once called the toughest province in all Vietnam for VC domination. This is the village of Phu Chan, whose 4,000 residents used to be safe only during the day. At night, the Viet Cong would come out of the dense jungle that surrounded Phu Chan to collect their taxes, get their provisions, terrorize the villagers. But now the jungle around Phu Chan has been knocked down. It's gone. And so is the Viet Cong. They had no place to hide. The same is true all over Binh Duong province. From the air, it looks as though some giant paring knife had peeled the top off the earth below. Each one of these $70,000 monsters can sweep 15 acres in a 10-hour day. In lower Binh Duong alone, they've cleared 3,000 acres to help bring security to 20,000 people. Security, a vital beginning to pacification. But the dozers do more than just knock things down. They help to build, too. The man in charge of the operation is Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig of Arlington, Virginia.
This is land that was formerly non-productive and of no value at all to the people.
Because it was jungle.
That's correct. Now we, of course, are clearing it, and we immediately follow up with development personnel to plant and to cultivate this land and make it productive for the people of Vietnam.
The plows sweep both sides of all important roads, too, making them secure for travel day and night. The men who man the plows are so proud of the work they're doing that they've left their special mark upon the countryside, the castle, the emblem of the engineers. Private First Class Joseph Martinez of Boston, Massachusetts runs this Rome plow. It looks as though it gives you quite a ride, Joe.
Sure does. You'll get tired after a day's work.
Any injuries inside?
No.
What about booby traps? Do you ever hit them?
Hit quite a few.
And?
Nobody gets hurt. Just might blow a little track off your dozer, but nobody gets hurt to it.
Do you feel as though you're helping to win the war?
Sure do.
In what way?
Well, push down all the Chinese jungle. We can't hide anywhere.
Mike Wallace, CBS News, Vinh Xuong Province.
In case you were wondering, yes, that's the same Alexander Haig who later became White House Chief of Staff under President Nixon and Secretary of State under President Reagan. Even with defoliation, a great deal of jungle remained, and the problem still was to find the enemy hiding beneath that canopy. Those of you who are Star Trek fans may recall a device aboard the Starship Enterprise capable of detecting life forms on unfamiliar planets. Science fiction, right? Well, not exactly. Something of the sort was used in Vietnam, as Steve Rowan reported.
Here's one way to find the enemy. Fly low enough so he'll shoot at you. But these daredevils of the 1st Infantry Division are doing much more than that, though. They're looking for enemy troops with the sniffer, a device that picks up the telltale odors of campfire smoke and urine, signaling their presence in the atmosphere like a thermometer registers the temperature. Hours at a time, back and forth over jungle-covered areas, populated only by unfriendly individuals with guns. A closer look at the sniffer with Captain Paul Gardner of Wood River Junction, Rhode Island.
This piece of equipment operates on the principle of just taking an air sample into it, processing some of the effluents or smells that's given off by the humans, and giving us eventually a reading here on the meter.
With the sniffer mounted in a chopper moving along at about 80 knots or so, right over the treetops, does that give you enough time to pick up a smell and analyze it and get a reading on it?
It sure does. We find that we hit a hot spot and we have a reading on this within the matter of a couple of seconds. We haven't moved over 80 meters by the time that we have the reading on it.
The dial indicates there's something down there. A campfire, a group of VC, or a few harmless water buffalo. Well, that the sniffer doesn't know, but something. The spot is marked on the map by an observer flying overhead. The coordinates given to the artillery boys, so they can give the area the once-over tonight.
0, 0, 2, 5, 8. These last readings were all ammonia readings.
A little later, another cluster of hot spots, and someone spots a hooch beneath the trees. No friendlies living in the area, so permission to fire is granted, and the escorting gunships race in. Today's mission is over. The map now contains marks indicating an area where the sniffer found evidence of human habitation. Tonight, artillery will pound that area. If the VC are there, they'll have to move. Tomorrow, the sniffer will be smelling them out again. Steve Rowan, CBS News, Xi'an.
Part of the frustration of the war in Vietnam was the enemy's ability to withdraw behind international borders. He carried supplies through Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and he set up bases in Cambodia, sending patrols across the border, then retreating to safety. American troops could not legally pursue across the Cambodian border, and many found that aggravating. John Lawrence reported.
The forces of this war follow an irregular pattern of shifting strategies and changing control. But sometimes the forces move in a definite direction, like these armored personnel carriers advancing to the border of Cambodia.
The United States 25th Division is chasing the North Vietnamese 7th Division. And since January 2nd, nearly 500 North Vietnamese have died. The closer they get to the border, the more the Americans resent the restriction. They are not allowed to cross, and the greater become the forces for enlarging the war. It could happen. 2 years ago, when the 25th Division first arrived in Vietnam, it was not allowed to fire so much as a single shot across the border. Rules of engagement are changing.
We are not under any orders to cross the border, have no intention of doing so except in the interest of the safety of our commands. In other words, if a unit becomes engaged and the proper military tactic would require crossing the border in a local sense, then of course it would be done, but only in the interest of protecting the command.
2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry is in contact. The fighting is well up ahead, but the bullets buzz into this position, and a .50 caliber tracer round sparks the soft, dry brush and starts a serious fire. A couple of kids from the forests of Oregon in the American Northwest take charge of the fire brigade, and the APCs rumble around and around, clearing a break in the Vietnam jungle. But there are bullets in among the flames, slapping up the dirt, glancing off the trees, and the firefighters are forced to take cover. Frustration. Now the fire is out of control. The rifles are cracking, and the soldiers cannot shoot back. There are friendly troops to the front. The young men who dodged the bullets to fight the fire.
I don't think it's fair. They can hit us and then run back across the border, and we can't do anything about it. I think we should be able to at least go part way into the border, if not all the way. It'll never end if we don't. This war will never end if we can't go in after them. Well, how's that? They just keep moving back in the border, and we can't go across after them. They bring a resupply across, and we stop them, but we can't go in after them.
In the mid-1960s, the nature of the war began to change. It became clear the enemy included not only the Viet Cong, but also the regular army of North Vietnam. The result was further escalation of American forces, not only men, but weapons. This was the American base at Long Binh, occupying an area larger than the city of Saigon, all of it jammed with the hardware of war. But to bring all this equipment in, we needed more deep water ports, and so they were built. The most important was the installation at Cam Ranh Bay, one of the great natural harbors of the Pacific Ocean. The United States built this port at a cost of $150 million. But the enemy was building strength also, including modern weapons from communist China and Russia. Some of those weapons were captured, but the enemy was increasingly well supplied. One of those weapons could be deadly against American armor, as Tony Sargent reported.
When tanks and armored personnel carriers like these move through hostile terrain, the crew is much aware of the initials RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, a most effective anti-armor weapon the enemy now has in plenty. Army weapons experts have great respect for the RPG.
It is a shoulder-fired weapon. With a standard open sighting arrangement, sir, rather than any sort of an optical sight. And this is fired by one man? Right, sir. It's a one-man operation. It's not a crew-served weapon. All right. And as it is fired, sir, the round comes out, the fins come out, and it's off, sir.
Right. When the South Vietnamese Army captures the enemy's rocket-propelled grenades, it destroys them on its own weapons ranges. Here is the RPG-2. The more sophisticated RPG-7 is capable of bursting in the air, giving it a slight anti-aircraft capability, useful against helicopters. When the RPG strikes a tank or other armor, it makes a deceptively small hole. But once inside, its explosion can touch off fuel or ammunition, causing virtual destruction of the vehicle.
What was it like inside that tank when the RPG hit?
Well, it was terrible. That's all. It, like I said, it tears everything up. It melts the steel, it gets molten and throws it all over. So besides being hit with the steel, it's white hot when it hits you and it burns.
Well, how much respect do you have for this enemy weapon?
You have a lot of respect for it, sir. It's the best man-fired weapon VC have.
The inside of one of these tanks used to be among the safest places in Vietnam. But the RPG has changed all that. Tony Sargent, CBS News, Phu Loy, South Vietnam.
But the most important communist weapon may have been this gun, a rifle designed in Russia, but also produced in communist China. It was called the automatic Kalashnikov 47, better known in the field as the AK-47. This became a standard weapon of the North Vietnamese and the main force Viet Cong. It was very accurate and could fire on automatic at the rate of 350 rounds a minute. Many experts believed it to be the equal of the new American rifle, the M16. Some GIs believed the AK was better. The early M16s developed a history of jamming during combat, and Don Webster reported one example.
Some of these men in the Army's 1st Division were caught in a communist ambush, and the resulting firefight lasted 2.5 hours. 4 Americans were killed and 27 wounded. But after the battle was over, the men told a grisly tale of rifle after rifle jamming on them during the fight. This lineup of rifles, all M16s which had malfunctioned during the battle, was silent testimony to the same fact. One of the men in the battle was PFC Stuart Dennis. Tell us what happened yesterday.
When I got out to the battle forward area, there was a firefight with the VC. There were heavy concentrated fire from our side to the VC. There was 16s jamming a great deal. The men were putting up the best they could, but the 16 would keep jamming. They'd throw it down and try and grab another one. And another man would come by and pick this one up because his had also jammed.
What was causing the jamming of the M16s, do you know?
It seems that the excessive firing through the 16 will cause it to jam after a certain period of time.
I understand that one of the men that was killed in the battle was carrying the Russian-made rifle that the Viet Cong used, the AK-47.
That's affirmative. He's carried it ever since I've known him. A great number of the men prefer the AK-47 to the M16.
American ammunition doesn't fit in the Russian rifle. How would he get ammunition?
He can buy it off the Arvins, or he can capture it off the dead VC.
The manufacturers of the M16 claim that it's the soldiers' fault that they don't keep it clean. What do the men think of that?
Well, cleanliness is a problem with the M16, but in the conditions around here, it's impossible to keep it as clean as they might think it should be clean. So I figure it's the weapon and not the men.
Most of the original complaints about the M16 had come from men in the Marine Corps. But after this battle, many of these soldiers are now adding their complaints. Don Webster, CBS News, near Lai Khe, South Vietnam.
Others gave the M16 higher marks, especially after modifications improved its reliability. It fired a small caliber bullet at high velocity and was accurate to about 400 yards, characteristics similar to those of the enemy's AK-47. The enemy's strategies included not only the conventional weapons of war, but also the use of terror. The Viet Cong in the countryside developed a selective program of kidnapping and assassination. The victims most often were village officials, school teachers, and development workers. But sometimes the killings were less selective and became massacres. Bernard Kalb reported one example.
This is the enemy's handiwork, the results of their midnight visit. Sometimes the enemy's calling card is small-scale horror. Sometimes it's big-scale horror. This time it's massive horror. The enemy was described as being part Viet Cong, part North Vietnamese. We asked Alan Lavelle of San Antonio, who helps direct the refugee program in this area, for the story of Doc Son.
I think primarily the VC were chagrined because these people have been very friendly to the government. So when they start to attack the village, the Montagnard men put their women and children down in these bunkers, you see. And then they stood outside to defend their families. And I don't know what they had in the way of weapons, but the average Montagnard you see has a spear, sometimes a blowgun, sometimes a crossbow. But the VC killed the men, shot them down in cold blood. And then I understand they went into the bunkers, set fire to the houses. Houses were built over the bunkers, and in many cases went into the bunkers with flamethrowers and sometimes threw in hand grenades. So when I arrived here on the scene yesterday morning, I saw smoking ruins. I peered down in the bunkers, and I saw women with their 3, 4, 5, and 6 children piled around them. Many of the bodies near the entrances were terribly burned, but I think most of the people were asphyxiated, and some were, of course, mangled by hand grenades. It was a really horrible sight. But all I can say is any men who would perpetuate something like this are not men, they're animals. This is not war. This is mass murder.
These are some of the survivors of Dak San. The only thing they still own are the few bits and pieces of clothing they wear.
Bernard Kalb, CBS News, in what's left of the village of Dak San.
The enemy also used terror in the cities of South Vietnam. There, the results were more visible, and the principal targets were Americans. One man, one Viet Cong, created havoc in Saigon until he was finally captured. Again, a report from Bernard Kalb.
His name is Nguyen Von Som, known as Sapper Sam. In 2 years, he commanded 29 operations in Saigon. A tough man who, if captured, would never confess under torture or the threat of a firing squad. This was the first of his 3 biggest jobs, the Brink U.S. officers' billet in the heart of the capital. 2 Americans dead, 63 Americans and Vietnamese injured. Sam had many narrow escapes, but he was prepared to die a VC hero. His next job was the old U.S. Embassy building. 2 Americans killed, 45 Americans injured, plus 118 Vietnamese casualties. The Mekong restaurant along the Saigon River, a popular eating place with Americans. Sapper Sam used his favorite technique. 1 mine exploded outside the restaurant. The surviving diners began running in panic, but a second mine caught them at the entrance. 50 people killed, including 12 Americans, more than 80 others injured.
I only learned of what happened through the newspapers. I did not see people die with my own eyes. When the newspapers said that there were Americans killed, I felt happy. But I felt sorry in my heart for the death of the Vietnamese people.
This was to be Sapper Sam's next big target, the U.S. complex that includes the Rex Officers Hotel and the headquarters of U.S. psychological warfare operations. But Sapper Sam was arrested on a tip 3 days before explosion time by Captain Pham Quan Tom of the Saigon Police.
I have one special idea, intention. I prepare one action by car.
The accident Captain Tom had in mind was this. He would take Sam out on the street at 1 in the morning and run a truck over his head, also over his motorbike. Sam would be found looking like the victim of a hit-and-run driver. He would not be a martyr, and he would lose face. This, Captain Tom believed, was the only way to make Sam confess. He would die like a dog in the street.
Conclusion. You die some one dog in the street.
It worked. Sam confessed.
A sapper was an explosives expert, but that could work both ways. An enemy sapper could plant his own explosives or disarm American explosives. American forces routinely mined the perimeters of their base camps, but were made aware that none of those defenses could be considered safe. Bob Simon reported.
One of the first things a GI learns about in Vietnam is the danger of communist sappers. This demonstration is staged once a week for new members of the 1st Cav. The man going through the wires once belonged to an elite North Vietnamese sapper battalion. He defected to Allied ranks a few years ago. Now he shows Americans the tricks of his trade. This complex of barbed wire and claymore mines resembles the perimeters of most American bases here. The mines are electrically controlled from the command post. When detonated, they fire off steel fragments which can kill anything within 50 yards. For the trained sapper, though, disconnecting the mine is no great problem. Getting through the barbed wire is only a question of time and patience, neither of which the communists have ever lacked.
Now that he's in the open a little bit, I want you to notice the coordination.
The lesson to the GIs, of course, is keep alert, never fall asleep on night watch. The enemy may be a few feet away.
As we mentioned earlier, the communists made extensive use of mines and booby traps. They caused a large percentage of American casualties in Vietnam. Outside Da Nang, the Marines created a school of landmine warfare to teach new arrivals how the Viet Cong set mines and traps. The Marines used giant firecrackers to simulate the real thing.
One round can be just as effective as anything else that you could possibly lose out in the field. By placing this in a small pit and a person coming along stepping on it, you could very easily end up like I just did. So we have one of the VC flags, which here we emphasize majority of the time is just that you should look out for souvenirs. Everyone wants a flag or some item to take home. It might be a pretty costly item for you to try to pick up.
Those booby traps were make-believe, but rooted in reality. Enemy explosives were planted all over South Vietnam. Finding them and destroying them was nerve-wracking and dangerous. George Severson reported.
This is one of the daily facts of life on the roads of Vietnam. Last night, the Viet Cong put up a roadblock here on Route 4, about 20 miles north of My Tho. The roadblock is an elaborate one. It probably took the Viet Cong and the villagers they forced to help them most of the night to build it. In the morning, when traffic started to move, the villagers had disappeared from their homes, and a few trees and mounds of dirt lay across the road. Under some of the mounds, explosives had been planted. These men of Charlie Company of the 9th Division's 15th Engineer Battalion are clearing the roadblock. The job is done by gently laying charges of C4, plastic explosives, on each of the piles of dirt and blowing them up. Everyone smokes on the job. Cigarettes may be hazardous to your health, but this job is infinitely more dangerous. The cigarettes help to calm strained nerves, and they're also the most practical way to light the fuses. Most of the Viet Cong mines are plastic grenades like these. They're virtually impossible to pick up on mine detectors when they're buried. How often do they put these things out in this area?
We've been getting about two a week in the last month and a half.
You ever lose any?
Heads up!
The charge left a huge hole that only bulldozers and graders could fill in, and delayed the reopening of the highway for 7 hours. A minor inconvenience for these travelers and truck drivers, but a pointed reminder to everyone that in a sense, the Viet Cong have as much control over Vietnam's roads as the government. George Severson, CBS News, on Route 4 in the Delta.
The war on land was complemented by the war on water. The Navy's war in Vietnam was fought on two separate fronts. One was off the coast of Vietnam, American aircraft carriers launching strikes against the enemy, a key part of the intensifying air war. Other missions off the coast included the battleship New Jersey, contributing some heavy-duty artillery support. The 16-inch guns fired explosive projectiles the size of a small automobile. But the enemy also was hunted from the rivers and canals of South Vietnam. The Viet Cong was accustomed to hiding along these waterways. It became more difficult to hide, as Larry Pomeroy reported.
There are certain areas of South Vietnam which are regarded as under the total control of the Viet Cong. Such is the case in the southern section of the Cam Peninsula, where just flying the flag invites the wrath of the enemy. This Navy swift boat patrol is part of the Gulf of Thailand surveillance group, operating in the remote regions of the country's southwest. There is grim evidence of Viet Cong power. Nam Can City was once the home of 150,000 people, most of whom were not loyal to the enemy. So the city was burned and ransacked by the guerrillas a year ago, left in abandoned ruins. Tensions build up as the boats investigate narrow canals off the river. Past experience on these irregular patrols in this area have taught the crews that the enemy remains unseen, but always there, watching from the banks. Often it's a matter of when he will strike, not if. The bark of Chinese Communist AK-47s comes from the left bank. The soft whoosh of badly aimed B-40 rockets comes from the right bank. The only casualty is cameraman Don McLeod, who received a minor shrapnel wound an inch from his right eye.
First I saw was an explosion on the deck of that other swift boat. Pow. It just blade. Didn't feel a thing. I thought it was a rocket ran or something hitting the deck of that other boat. Just a bang. That's it.
Does it hurt now?
Nah. No, negative.
The patrol continues. The crews are used to firefights. Sometimes they run up 3 sharp battles a day with the enemy. The crew of our swift boat had their last vessel sunk from under them. The chief of Namkan District and his U.S. Army advisor are met on the river. The Navy swift boats are the main support for the government's 4 regional force companies in this area.
For 50 days in the months of November and December, we were hit something like 29 mortar attacks, if I can remember correctly, 4 ground attacks, and numerous other incidents. Since the swift boats have come up, we've only had 1 mortar incident since then. So you can see generally from that the security picture has increased considerably.
There is no question that this patrol's progress through the Kamau Peninsula's network of canals and rivers has been carefully followed by the Viet Cong. On its last visit, the patrol left receiving rounds of small arms fire as the enemy's parting gesture. So this time, the patrol has obtained permission from the district chief to shoot at the banks in an area declared a free fire zone.
The river patrols encompassed a wide variety of naval craft, including monitor gunboats, named after the armor-clad warship of the Civil War. And convoys of floating artillery bases, some equipped with their own helicopter landing platforms. An even more unusual vessel was described by Ike Pappas.
This is the start of Operation Quai Vat, and a very well-named operation it is, because in Vietnamese, Quai Vat means monster.
These monsters are more commonly known as hovercraft, the strange land and sea vehicle that rides on its own cushion of air. This operation is actually an experiment for the hovercraft. Before this, they were used mainly for river patrol. Now they are being thrown into direct combat with the Viet Cong to see how they will fare. The VC often ride in camouflage sampans under trees and in patches of brush. Helicopters spot the sampans from the air and then drop a smoke grenade to mark the spot. The hovercraft then move in, guns firing. Besides a score of Viet Cong dead, the hovercraft also claimed a handful of communist prisoners in the fight. Some of them had to be pulled from the water. They were discovered hiding beneath the surface, breathing through bamboo reeds jutting from the water. The hovercraft seemed to be proving their worth in the tough Delta War. Traveling at speeds up to 60 miles an hour, they can cover territory in a single day that often took weeks to clear.
These hovercraft sailors like to say that they hit all the Viet Cong that they aim at. And those they add with a smile that get away are probably frightened to death. Ike Pappas, CBS News, in the Delta near Ma Qua.
The air war over Vietnam has been described in another cassette in this series, but it's worth taking a closer look at one of the results of the air war, because it tells us something else about the nature of the enemy. Hundreds of American airmen were shot down by the communists and taken prisoner. Those flyers were the vast majority of the American prisoners of war. Many were forced to cooperate in communist propaganda and to sign confessions of war crimes. The prisoners of war became, in a real sense, pawns of war. bargaining chips in the peace talks that seemed to drag on forever. What we did see of the prisoners was carefully stage managed. These scenes filmed at a prison scornfully known as the Hanoi Hilton. The filming was done by a Japanese news agency with close ties to North Vietnam and portrayed the prisoners on and about Christmas Day, 1970. What we were supposed to see was a heartwarming picture of well-treated Americans. But look carefully at the faces in some of the scenes that follow. The fact is, there was no joy in this world.
We get up rather early in the morning, about 5:30. We have our breakfast is brought to us about 6:30. 7. And then at 6:30 also we hear some music, international music. 7 o'clock we're let out of our room to take care of the daily chores that we have in the morning.
Well, we are practicing for the Christmas program at the present time.
How have you prepared for the celebration of Christmas?
And we have been working on some music for about a month now.
What is your name and your rank?
Norman McDaniel, Captain, United States Air Force.
What we did not know at the time was how badly the prisoners had been treated. We found out in 1973, after the ceasefire agreement led to the prisoners' release. Many of the POWs had been systematically tortured to obtain information or to force their cooperation. Some were even tortured to make them say how well they'd been treated. Commander Richard Stratton had been filmed in 1967 bowing to his communist captors. He told reporters after the war he'd been forced to do that, but deliberately exaggerated the bow to make it appear he had been drugged.
I have been beaten. I have been placed in solitary confinement for a total of 18 months during my captivity. I have been harassed. I have been humiliated. I have been put on public display. For those of you that would care to look at it, there are scars on my elbows and on my wrists. There are marks from cigarette burns. They have bent back 2 nails which have grown back in. They have so immobilized my arms that I could not retract my hands in this manner, nor could I lift my arms higher than this when they were finished.
Many prisoners told of an ordeal by rope, arms tied tightly behind them, then pulled up until the blood circulation was cut off. Many also had heavy bars placed on their ankles, cutting off circulation to the feet. One of those tortured was Navy Captain James Mulligan.
How much can you take? I don't know. You show me a man who says, well, they won't break me. I wouldn't give them anything. Well, I think they just don't understand the problem. You see, you want to die, but they won't let you. And they got many ways, and they got lots of time. And you can hang in there, but they'll win. And I don't know anyone that they weren't able to get essentially what they wanted when they worked them long enough.
The enemy in Vietnam was sometimes cruel, always determined. He left behind a history of torture, assassination, terrorism. But he knew how to endure privation, and he knew how to fight. And when the war was over, he had prevailed. This is Walter Cronkite, and this has been another in our continuing series of video cassettes on the Vietnam War.
These are new life hamlets? These are new life hamlets, so anybody we find in this area, we can evacuate them back and they'll have food and shelter.
As the villagers are walked away, soldiers of the 1st Division pour gas grenades into the bunker and tunnel complex that catacombs the village. This is gas designed for riot control. Non-lethal, but it can make a human uncomfortable and helpless long enough to disarm him. That's Lieutenant John Olson from Pottsville, Wisconsin, throwing in the gas. He says he doesn't like using it, but calls it the only way to handle these intricate bunkers and tunnels without extreme risk to the lives of his men. No one, alive or dead, is found in the holes. But just as the gassing ends, heavy shells start pouring in on the U.S. troops involved.
What's going on? Where's the landing? Back here?
In the first confusing moments, the company commander thinks we're being hit by our own artillery or airstrike. But those are enemy shells coming in, it is said later. No one is certain what kind, but the men under fire believe they are 120-millimeter mortar rounds. The 120-millimeter mortar is a Chinese favorite, copied from the Russians. Whatever it was, injured 2 soldiers, including this one, who took shell fragments in the shoulder. Later, this same unit tries to move an armored convoy out of its campsite along the river. Because of the French Army's sad experience with tanks and other armor in Vietnam, U.S. forces have been leery of using it. But this is the dry season, and the terrain here is comparatively high. And some of the brass insist on experimenting with armor. The tanks and armored personnel carriers move less than 2 miles from the camp when one tank is disabled by a...
The Viet Cong. The enemy is seen through his own eyes, his own propaganda films. Except for those films, he remained largely unseen. The Viet Cong had a talent for disappearing. The Vietnam War was unlike most wars in American history. In other wars, we knew the enemy and could identify him. In Vietnam, our enemies could hardly be distinguished from our friends. The Viet Cong melted into the jungles, mingled with the local civilians, and waited for the moment to attack. Most of the battles were short and swift, firefights, ambushes. The strategy was to hit and run and vanish. The Viet Cong, later joined by the regular army of North Vietnam, was waging war against the most powerful nation in the world. Communist troops were the targets of huge quantities of modern weapons. They suffered tremendous losses, and yet they persevered. Vietnam was more than firepower. It also was willpower. The enemy was well supplied with that. American combat troops first landed in Vietnam in 1965, and from the beginning they found it to be a dangerous, frustrating war. It was not then a war of pitched battles. It was instead an episodic war. Landmines and booby traps and sniper fire. No single news report could sum up all the frustrations of trying to find and fight an elusive enemy. But the film you're about to see includes quite a few of them. The correspondent, Dan Rather.
U.S. forces now say they have solid intelligence reports that Chinese communist advisors are operating with the Viet Cong in this area.
Stay on the road.
In this village, along the Saigon River's banks, residents admit a Viet Cong battalion with Chinese advisors spent the night, moving out just a few hours before U.S. troops came in. Our troops continue burning every hut they find and all crops, convinced that practically every man, woman, and child in this section belongs to the Viet Cong. In charge of today's mission, Captain Edward Yago.
There is soon-to-be VC. This entire area has been under VC control for many years, and we consider every suspect to be VC.
Now, what are you doing with these people?
We're checking them, trying to find out intelligence information, whether or not VC were in the area. We found a lot of indications that VC have been here. A lot of rice. We found over 18 tons of rice, ammunition, papers, VC certificates, etc.
And what are you doing with these people?
We're getting them now and trying to make a note so they can have safe passage back to hamlets they have set up, the nearest one here.
A discarded tin can is filled with TNT and pieces of metal and glass. It is then set into the ground and camouflaged, a homemade mine. Some of these mines will explode when a tripwire is kicked. Some will explode on contact. The Viet Cong have also dug into their own Vietnamese history. They have rediscovered traditional weapons that were used against enemies of the past. A kicked tripwire can drop a wasp's nest on your head. This arsenal may be old-fashioned, but it's lethal. A tiger trap for men. These razor-sharp spikes of bamboo are often poisoned with human feces. These punji sticks are so dangerous that all American combat boots now have soles lined with steel. Their strategy calls for constant sabotage, and their sabotage is selective. The Viet Cong study their targets in miniature. Planning can take weeks, sometimes months. The explosives...
Enemy fire opens up from surrounding bushes, and a furious fight to defend the tanks ensues.
these armored convoys trying to move out of the area we were just sweeping through. One of the tanks has been hit, and the Viet Cong has opened fire on the convoy. They're now firing back and have asked for air support.
Infantry support rushed to the scene, comes in, guns blazing. Enemy fire keeps some of the late arrivals pinned down for a while, but eventually the disabled tanks have an infantry defense perimeter. The tankers come out of their vehicles again, and the firefight rages on.
It's this way approximately half the time still in South Vietnam when we try to move convoys. Dan Rather, CBS News, with the 1st to the 16th, 1st Division Tank Attachment Element, South Vietnam.
The communist forces made do with what they had. Sometimes modern weapons, sometimes weapons that could only be described as primitive. Much of the time they improvised, using captured weapons or manufacturing their own. They were at the least ingenious, as Bernard Kalb reported in 1968.
The Viet Cong today get their most sophisticated weapons from the communist countries, but a dud U.S. bomb is a gift from heaven. The bomb is defused. The steel casing is used to make shrapnel. The TNT is carefully collected. It will be used for grenades, mines, and mortar shells.